Are mediums just con artists? Or is it possible that people can directly communicate with the deceased? Today's guest is Bob Ginsberg. He's a former skeptic who went through the loss of his daughter tragically, and he became obsessed with finding scientific evidence of what happens to your consciousness after you die.
So Bob is a friend of our family that we've known for a very long time, and I've been following his work for a very long time. And he and his wife Phran started a foundation called the Forever Family Foundation over 20 years ago, and to help families dealing with the unimaginable grief of losing a child or losing someone, and being able to see through research, through science, whether or not consciousness exists in the afterlife. Does that continue on? And it has been really something that I have found I've been interested in for a long time, but especially after my mom's passing, I've been much more interested in it. And this conversation with Bob was just really amazing to have somebody that we know who's doing this work and actually feel like it's real. What did you feel like, Christy, after this? Because I know you are our skeptic.
I love that my favorite part of what the Forever Family Foundation does is the way that they certify mediums through evidence-based a process. So you'll listen to it in the episode, but for me as a skeptic myself, hearing that process gives me comfort in opening my mind up to the possibility that this is real. So the big talk question that we have for listeners, something to say at your Thanksgiving table, is to ask, have you ever had an experience that seemed like a message from someone who has passed away? Enjoy our conversation with Bob.
Bob, welcome to the Opposite of Small Talk. I have been very much looking forward to this conversation, and we are very excited to have you here.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
So we want to start off with the way we start with all of our guests, which is asking them to tell us a little bit about themselves and how they've come to do the work that they do.
Well, 23 years ago, I never could have imagined that I'd be doing what I'm doing now. I mean, I was a left brain thinker, logical, materialistic, doing, caught up in everything. I never really pondered what happens after we die. To me, the concept of life after death made no sense. We were a product of our brain. Our brain produced consciousness. The brain is no more, so how could we still exist? So I thought that the concept was silly. I thought mediums were a bunch of fortune tellers, that were fraudulent. As usually happens, sometimes tragedy is a catalyst to exploration and learning. My son and my daughter were in a car accident. My daughter didn't survive. My son had, serious brain injuries at the time, and it was, my whole world was blown apart. And I'd spent the first year, every night just praying to the universe that I would die in my sleep. I didn't see any way that I could possibly survive the loss. And eventually, I was open to finding out, as parents who've lost their children or anybody that suffered a loss of any type, you want to know two things. Is it possible that they still survive? And are they okay? And I took the science approach to it, and I traveled across the United States meeting with medical doctors and scientists and researchers that studied the mind and consciousness. I took part in some research. I read literally hundreds upon hundreds of books. make a long story short, I mean, here I am today, and I was amazed at the amount of evidence that there is that we're more than our physical bodies, and that our consciousness or mind or soul or whatever you prefer to call it continues on after the body is shed, after the physical, body is gone. And that evidence comes in many forms, near-death experiences and reincarnation and after-death communications and deathbed visions, all these things. And many of these things have been studied in laboratory type, clinical, studies but almost as important are the anecdotal accounts, stories. But, when you have millions upon millions of people around the world telling similar stories, you have to pay attention to it because something is going on. So I got into this, through tragedy, but it also gave me some meaning and purpose in my life when I had, none before. And after we started Forever Family Foundation, that's been our aim. We work with the bereaved, people who have suffered all types of losses, and we're not therapists, and we're not psychologists, although, many of them are on our board, but we try to improve people's grief by information, because if you can come to believe that your loved one still exists in some form, it can make it easier to live your life, Also, it goes a long way in removing your own fear about death. And that's another story, that we live in a society where everybody does everything they can to, try to stave off, death. So that's a long-winded answer to why I'm doing what I'm doing now.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that. And I just want to share with our audience a little bit of our history, I guess, is I think we probably met when I was about 7, and you hired my mom to work for you. So I remember your daughter, Bailey. I remember when she was born, I think. And I remember when she passed away, too, and I'm so sorry for that loss. But that it has brought you to do this work, and I know that it has affected so many people's lives, is really amazing. So
yeah. What I didn't mention to you, which was the real reason that I was open to this stuff, is that on the morning that my kids were in the accident, Phran, my wife, sat up in bed like about 3:00 in the morning, and she was shaking and trembling. And I said, "What's the matter?" She wouldn't even talk. She just stared. And I said, "What's the matter?" And she said, "Something horrible is going to happen today." And I said, "Well, what does that mean? Can you give me any details?" And she said, I can't tell you. All I could tell you is that our lives are going to be changed forever today." And even though I didn't, so-called believe in things like visions and precognition and all that stuff, there were many times in our lives together where she had similar visions or precognitive dreams, and they always turned out exactly the way she said they would. But they were always good things, but logic told me if she was right then, she could be right now. And then, to make a long story short, I watched over my 3 kids, during the day. I let my guard down, and then my son and my daughter were in that accident. And I was in total shock because of Bailey's dying, and I didn't know whether, my son John was going to live, and they couldn't tell me either. He was in a coma. And eventually, when he came out of the coma and it was clear that he was going to survive and be okay, only then did I remember that morning, And then, of course, the burning question was, how did she know? Because she knew, That's what started me on the search, and because people do have, I don't know whether it was a precognitive dream, and maybe you're seeing the future. I don't know if it was a message that somebody was sending her, from the other side. But it was clear that she knew, so that was the impetus that got me going on this path.
So tell us a little bit about
when you started this journey, what were the things that surprised you most?
Well, I began my search by studying things like ESP and telepathy and things of that nature, and remote viewing and distant healing, because it showed that our minds can go beyond our body. That even though our brains are contained in our skull, you shouldn't be able to receive information from somebody that's on the other side of the world, because you're here and they're there. So something is traveling is a poor word, but the connections are being made. And unless you can come to believe that, our minds can act independently of our brains, and you can't believe in life after death, because obviously when you die, you no longer have a brain, but you still have a mind. So I started there, and what amazed me was that there were very, very credible researchers that have been doing studies on psychic information for 50 years, and when you did an analysis and the statistical analysis, the odds against chance of all these happenings were in the billions to one. So, that was intriguing, and I was like, why doesn't everybody know this, And from there, I studied, near-death experiences, and in near-death experience, you have people that meet every definition that medical science has for death. They have no brain waves, they have no heartbeat, they have no respiration, they have no reflexes. Medical science says they're dead. And yet those people that are able to be resuscitated often report these leaving their body, and sometimes even be able to, they can see that if they're in a hospital, the doctors, working on them. They talk about things like being greeted by, deceased loved ones, and they describe the environment and having 360-degree vision, and these things. The most important thing is they describe these clear and lucid thinking. You say, wait a second, how do you have clear and lucid thinking if no brain waves? That's not possible. There are cases of people. Dr. Kenneth Ring did a study of people who are blind. They've been sightless since birth. And when they're resuscitated, they can describe the colors that everybody was wearing, all the instruments, what people were doing, because once freed of their physical infirmity, they could see, and so, and that stuff is, so, it's some of the stuff is, mind-blowing, to people, but then when you look at the evidence, so that was one of the things, that really, I think it's a tremendous amount of evidence. I mean, there's one case of a person that had, all the blood drained from their body in a serious, operation. They were as dead as you could be. And when she got resuscitated, she told the nurse to go up on the 9th floor and told her the room to look out on the ledge, because she said she was above the hospital and she saw a pair of sneakers lying on the ledge. And she described the sneakers, the color, the way the laces were intertwined, the way one sneaker was on the other. And the nurse decided to humor her and went up on the 9th floor, and it was exactly the way she described it. So if you could rule out the possibility that she was in a helicopter before and she saw this, or, how is that possible, So there's a lot of credible accounts like that. Mediumship is one of the areas, as that we're very much involved with. It's somewhat easy. Well, it's not easy, but you can dismiss one area of research. As near-death experiences is due to oxygen deprivation, and hallucinations, which. I could debate that, and of course it's not that. But when you look at all the areas, and you step back, the explanation that makes the most sense is that we survive our physical death when you take all the evidence as a whole. It's fascinating. I learn every day.
So I am your resident skeptic,
Yeah.
just so that you know.
Who was a skeptic?
But I'd love to maybe talk about mediumship, because that's an area where I could envision that there's better potential to sort of certify the validity. Like when you talk about a near death experience, you
Yeah.
are talking about an individual's account versus something that you could try to replicate in mass or do. So I was interested in, I had listened to something that talked about how you certify mediums. And to me, that was very compelling, this idea that you could take out the possibility that a medium's kind of reading the person versus actually receiving a message from the other side. So can you
Right.
maybe talk a little bit about what a medium is, and then how that certification process works?
Yeah, well, a medium is simply somebody that claims to be able to talk with somebody that's deceased, a discarnate entity. There's, in my first book that I wrote about the medium explosion, I said in the book that based upon my own research and based upon my own experience witnessing 1,000 readings, that 85 to 90% of the mediums can't do what they claim. It's not that they're all fraudulent. Some are, and today it's very easy with social media to be fraudulent. And before we started the foundation, I went to a couple of mediums. I didn't believe in them, but Phran, my wife, dragged me, and so I went. One of them was incredible, but the others, 2 or 3, were terrible. And I realized that, there are no regulatory bodies for a medium. There's no licensing, there's no certification, there's no continuing education, there's no proficiency guidelines. Anybody, you, Christy, tomorrow say, I'm Christy the medium, start charging people $300 for a reading and do it. So we also, in working with the bereaved, we wanted to have a resource for the bereaved. So there are scientists that study mediumship in various universities, not only in this country, but in Europe. And I met with them, and I picked their brains, and then I developed, based upon a lot of their suggestions, our own certification process. And in a certification process, what we're doing is we're evaluating their accuracy. They're giving information, we're scoring it. In a certification process that we do, each medium does a series of 5 readings for 5 different sitters. The sitters are trained by me in how to score it, that they know about mediumship and what to expect, what constitutes specific evidence versus general information, and so forth. And we started certifying the mediums in 2005, so that's, 20
years.
20 years now. And in 20 years, we certified 27 mediums. So do the math. That's a little more than 1 per year. So it's tough, and
Right.
the medium's not going to pass because we have 5 different scoring methods. We make sure that the sitter has no knowledge of the medium and vice versa. The medium only knows the sitter. The sitter is the person getting the reading, their first name. So they can't Google them, or look them up. And then they provide the evidence, and we score it. There's also a difference between psychic information and mediumistic information. So what I mean by that is, like what you were referring to, there are people that are gifted in reading somebody's energy. You hear like they're reading my mind, and so forth. Mm-hmm. And there are people that are very good at it, and it's amazing. But for our purposes, we're trying to show that we survive our physical death, that our mind continues. So we're not interested in the psychic stuff. We're interested in mediumistic evidence. And as you alluded to, evidence is something that we can validate. I mean, the sitter knows if they know the information. If the medium says they have their deceased mom and their mom is deceased, well, we know that to be true. If they give specific information that nobody could have known, we also know that to be true. And so, we take a composite of all 5 readings, and it's a pretty good, and nobody's going to pass and gain our certification without being very, very gifted at, at this. And my purpose in the book was not to bash mediums, even though I got some nasty emails from mediums thinking that's what I was doing, but it was the opposite. I wanted to show that the other 10 to 15% can do this with amazing accuracy, and they also have the power to change people's lives by if you go into a reading in terrible grief, and the medium gives you an extraordinary reading with stuff only I mean, you're probably going to walk out of there feeling better than when you walked in. And well, maybe this is right. Maybe my loved one still exists. So, on the other hand, if you go to a medium and the medium gives you a terrible reading, you may be in worse shape than when you were when you walked in. That's why we take it's a very, very mediums have a very, very big responsibility. They have to take it seriously, and it's a hard job.
Hey,
So,
Bob, I had the funniest thought as you were describing the certification process
Yeah.
of these 5 sitters that you have.
Yeah.
And they're like going to sit for their reading, and their same deceased like parent or sibling or someone is like, oh, they're doing another assessment. I got to go tell this person about the locket or whatever it is to like
know.
help this person pass the test.
I know. Well, it's interesting you say that, because when we first started doing this 20 years ago, we used to do it in a physical location. Matter of fact, the first one we did, we rented the Huntington Hilton, and you probably know where that is. And we set up partitions, and we had the sitter behind the partition, and the medium, so the medium couldn't see the sitter. And the mediums were going from sitter to sitter, so they were doing 5, 6 readings back to back to back, and that's pretty difficult. And then we moved to doing it online after platforms like Zoom came out, but we still the mediums were doing 5 readings at the same time, and we had such a low percentage of people that passed, and it dawned on me, well, maybe this is too much, not only to ask of the medium, but to ask the person in spirit to get like
To show up 5
how many times
for the different.
yeah, so then now we do it where they only do 1 reading per day, but you know what, it didn't change the percentage,
percentages. Oh, that's
whatever, so
interesting.
I don't know, but that's the way we do it now. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. I do think I have this general like hatred for the kind of person that would charlatan show up as a medium to exploit a grieving person. Like that to me is just like the most horrific, awful thing, because of course they want to be connected to their deceased loved one, and like what an awful human that would do that. So I think I've probably thrown the baby out with the bathwater, I guess is the phrase, right? I just and just like discarded it as an idea. So I really appreciated the idea of like a certification that truly is like blind and data based.
And I agree with you. I mean, I was horrified, that these people were, are sitting out there. There's also a lot of mediums that are, they're not fraudulent, but they're just inexperienced. So, we all have intuitive ability, to a certain degree. Some have it, much more than others, but somebody, says a couple of things, and then their friend said, well, you should be a medium, and they go out there and hang out a shingle, and, and that's that. And we're trying to, avoid, that kind of, explosion of mediums on every corner, because a lot of the mediums and, unfortunately, a lot of the mediums that we certified over the years became very famous. which kind of defeats the purpose, because when you become famous, you do fewer and fewer readings because you don't have to. They charge a tremendous amount of money, and their waiting lists are years long. So that if this is a resource for the bereaved, what good does that do? You need a reading, and so that's why we're always looking to identify newer mediums that have accessibility, but yet are very good. Fortunately, we certified 4 in the past year, which is a lot higher than our average. So
is there a way that people, if they are really in tune with their intuition, can hone this ability?
Yeah, it's a good question, because people ask, are we born with this ability, or can it be learned? I mean, my feeling is that it certainly can be developed, and improved, but you still have to have that innate ability that you're born with to build upon. And if you have that, then you can go to mediumship development courses and really improve your craft. But if you are very, very limited intuitively, you're never going to become a great medium. Also, interestingly enough, there are my observation is that most mediums have somebody in their immediate family or even grandparents that had these abilities. And so there may be some sort of a genetic, component to this. I also find interesting that a lot of mediums develop physical ailments, and I think that's because the really good ones, I mean, they're feeling, like they're doing a reading, they're saying, well, I'm feeling a tightness in my chest. I mean, did Dad die from a heart attack or something like that? They're very empathic, and the feeling, sometimes mediums will even start crying and whatever. So that has to take a toll on the body as well. So.
And I wonder too, like, what's they don't have an obligation to respond to these spirits, right? Like, I could imagine if you have that gift, it's also a burden in some way, right? So, like, do you find that most people who have this gift want to, is it like a calling and they want to be a medium, or are they're people that's like, look, I'm over talking to all these dead people, I just want to go live my life?
That's right, and we get a tremendous number of people that they're scared and they're bewildered because they have these abilities, and which everybody tells them is impossible, and they're labeled and judged, and so they keep it secret. And many of the mediums, when you talk to, they had these gifts from when they were little children, but they didn't come out in the open with it, until adulthood, and even then, sometimes it's later, adulthood, because we live in a society that says if you can't perceive something with your known physical senses, then it doesn't exist. So people are, they're afraid, and they want to know how they can, like you said with mediums, how do you navigate this world if you constantly have, you're picking up information from information fields and from other dimensions all the time. So the mediums will tell you that they have to be able to turn it off, so to speak, so they can, live their lives. I was on the advisory board of a study that's being done at Yale Medical School, and what they're doing is they were working with mediums and people, that are gifted, psychically, and they are trying to figure out, they're also measuring their brain waves, how they're able to turn off the voices, because it was done in the psychiatric department at Yale Medical School. So they want to maybe, instead of trying to cure people or treat people with medication, treat them the techniques that mediums use to turn off the voices. Maybe people are being given all these these drugs when they don't have to be. So I thought that was an interesting study, you know. And there are many of the scientists that we work with now that are doing that. They're measuring brain waves when mediums are engaged in, you know, in spirit communication, to see if there are any areas of the brain that either light up or go dark, you know. And if they find, you know, consistencies, so it's amazing. I mean, ultimately, does all the research do any good? I mean, only if they develop a way that you and I can do this, you know. The goal is to do away with the mediums, and, you know, so to have everybody to, you know, there's such a thing as induced after-death communication, which was developed by a psychologist named Dr. Alan Botkin. And he was working for the VA, and he was a psychologist for all these veterans that had PTSD and came back and were haunted by the people that they killed and so forth. And I don't know if you ever heard of EMDR, but the EMDR it's a standard protocol now that, you know, it's accepted in mainstream. But he was working with a patient, you know, trying to break that loop of grief using EMDR, and he lost track of the number of it's based on eye movements, and all of a sudden the patient started talking to somebody that, the soldier talking to somebody that he had killed, in the war. And he thought that was amazing, and the psychologist, Dr. Botkin, he didn't believe in life after death. He didn't know what was going on. But he thought it was curious, so he went back over his notes, and he found out what he did wrong, and he did it again with another patient. And that patient started talking to, deceased loved ones. And then he gave his notes to a colleague and asked the colleague to follow the notes and do the procedure. And then the same thing was happening with the colleague's patient. So he developed this, and now he trains psychologists, all over the world in this procedure, which is kind of fascinating because it's something that can be facilitated by somebody else, to get you, so.
Is that the goal, to have anybody be able to talk to spirits?
If they want to. I think that if we go back to ancient times, I think that's the way it used to be. And it sort of got weaned out of us. I mean, I think it was a very thin line separating the world. I mean, the ancients used to talk to their relatives on a regular basis. I mean, there were cultures of tribal people that used to plan their daily activities based upon the consensus of dreams that people used to have. So there was a lot of things that were going on. The ancient Greeks used to go into caves, very dimly lit, that used to have a reflecting pond, and they used to go there and sit, like sensory deprivation, and talk to their loved ones. And Dr. Raymond Moody, who was a medical doctor, decided to build a psychomantium, in his lab, and started putting people in. And then researchers started doing it in the universities. I built one in my house, actually. I went out and studied it, and I built one in the house. One of these things are based on sensory deprivation, because you have to, that's why people sometimes have like dream visitations, where they're able, it's different than a regular dream. In a regular dream, as you know, it's very disjointed and it's all over the place and it doesn't make much sense. But sometimes people describe being able to talk to a deceased loved one, and they could touch them and have a conversation with them and smell them and hug them, and it's totally different, and they never forget it, and they wake up. Well, the theory is that the person in this other dimension, in the spirit world, when you're in certain stages of sleep, your chatter mind is at rest, so they have like a clear channel to get through when they can't, when you're active. So a lot of it that's why meditation is recommended by mediums, as a way to try to, connect. So, people try all sorts of things.
Well, they also say, and I have a memory of this, of like children are pretty receptive to this, and I think that's before we get ruled by our left brain and told that we have to be analytical about everything that we do. But I have a very clear memory of, like, after my grandfather passed away, I was 7, And I remember saying to my grandmother, like, no, I can hear him. He's here. And she was like, what? And I was like, yeah, no, he's here and he's okay. So I don't know that I've had any other experiences than that, but it just, at the time, it seemed so okay to me. Not something to be afraid of, and not necessarily, but it wasn't, you weren't told that that was wrong or that couldn't be, I guess, maybe. And I've heard a lot of other accounts of people saying that, like, children,
Yes.
a friend shared a story with me the other day that they had a daughter who passed away, and then their son, who was a few years old, like, they walked in and he was talking to her in his crib. And so, like, that was, and he's like, I believe that was real. Like, he was talking to her.
Yeah.
And so I wonder if there's
Absolutely.
another part of that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think those are the most evidential cases because, children, they're just innocent. They're going to say whatever, happens. Like, as you've mentioned, they haven't been told that it's wrong or it's not real, and then they give accounts. They talk about seeing, a grandmother that they never met, and picking them out of a photo album, with hundreds of people. And of course, there's a lot of research that's been going on for 50 years with past life memories of children, where when they're young, they describe a past life, and the scientists and researchers become like detectives because they interview the kids and they get as much factual information as they can, and then they go back and they pull medical records and school records and everything else, police reports, and in some cases they even can accompany the children to the family that they describe that they used to be part of, and there's a lot of work. And first it was Dr. Ian Stevenson at the University of Virginia, thousands of cases over 40 years, and his work continued by Dr. Jim Tucker. And I don't know if you got a chance to watch the Surviving Death on Netflix. We were a part of that, but there's 6 episodes. The first episode is on near-death experiences, and I think the last episode's on reincarnation. And there are some really compelling cases, and even there you can score the evidence. You could go piece by piece of what the child claimed and what can be verified. So a lot of these things are anecdotal, but a lot of them, can be. You can use scientific protocol to show that the information is true.
Why do you think that if there's so much evidence out there, that this is still something that people really have trouble believing or grasping or so skeptical about? And the thing that the thing that keeps coming back to me too is like, I feel like in the world people talk about like, oh, that person's an old soul, but that's as far as it goes. Or, oh, I had this experience, but that's as far as it goes. And like, everybody tries to keep it at bay in some way of like, it can't be real. This weird thing happened, but that can't be real. And that we're in this like limbo almost, and that it isn't more talked about.
Yeah. Well, it's better than it was, when we started this in 2003. We used to get phone calls and in the office, and the person would be whispering, and you can't understand them, and my wife, who was a little bit hard of hearing in one ear, she was really having a hard time. And she'd say, "Why are you whispering?" Because it turned they lived in a Bible Belt. God forbid somebody overheard the conversation. A lot of it has to do with religion, because religions tell people that it's okay for the people within the religion to do it, but you don't, you can't communicate, with the dead. But also, I mean, as I said before, we rely totally on our known, 5 senses, and we think that's all there is. And the 6th sense and other senses are something you see in movies, but not real. And so if you're talking about that seriously, you're going to be judged. There's one example that I use is when I was living in New York, I had a family doctor who also happened to be a friend of mine. And about 2 years after my daughter died, I went to him for some ailment. I don't remember what. And I waited my turn in the waiting room, and then I finally got in to see him. And, he said, Bob, how you doing? Okay. He says, what have you been doing? I said, well, you really want to know? He says, yeah. I said, I'm studying survival of consciousness. He just looked at me, and we start talking more, and then he stops. He says, let me ask you something. I said, why? He says, what's survival of consciousness? And I start explaining and talking about some of the things that we're talking about tonight. And in the middle of the conversation, his nurse walked in, and she was very interested in our conversation because she had lost a child to crib death, and she, was, wanted to know if, where did her child go. And eventually she left the room, and he closed the door, and he got a real serious look on his face. He says, can I tell you something? I said, well, he said, my father died 8 years ago. I said, oh, I'm sorry. He says, yeah, but he died at 9 o'clock in the morning, and but I had a lot of seriously ill patients that I had to call and check up on, and I did, and I called, the answering service, and they said, they're reading them back the messages, and one of the messages, he says, oh, your father called. And he says, my father died at 9 o'clock this morning. And they said, oh, I'm so sorry, doctor, I'm so sorry. We must have gotten the message wrong. He must have said your father-in-law. He said, no, my father-in-law's been dead for 16 years. So he says, what time did the call come in? It's at 9:10. He says, read me back the message. The message was, Frank, it's me. I'm okay. So now, he held that in for 8 years, but, I was in his office, and he heard what was coming out of my mouth. He knew I wasn't going to judge him, so he told me. He had never told anybody in his family. He didn't tell his wife. He didn't tell his kids. He certainly wasn't going to tell his colleagues, right? But I presented an opportunity. And you know what? I guarantee you, that was 20 years ago. He still hasn't told the soul. But it's a shame, because one of the things that we try to get people to do is simply share. Don't try to convince anybody, but share your experiences. Because when everybody starts sharing instead of keeping it in, it gets more mainstream, and then it gets more attention, and it gets more funding and studying and so forth. But you're absolutely right. I mean, there's still a stigma, about talking about such things. But
that's where I think the internet has been quite helpful, right? Is you've got a small number of people who are willing to share, and then it finds the right other people, and then it becomes more and people just have the platform to share more stuff. People are creating content and sharing stories in a variety of places.
Yeah, and when we were desperate, to at the beginning, I found a grief support group, which was made up of parents who lost children, and it was in Long Island. It was about 45 minutes away. So I grabbed, my wife, and I said, well, let's go down to this group, and we did, and we found is that every time that because I had already started looking into all this stuff, and every time that I raised my hand and brought up the afterlife or life after death, the moderator would shut us down. Like, we don't talk about such things here. Our job is to focus on the ways you can cope with your grief and so forth. Which I thought that was odd, because frankly, all anybody wanted to talk about, all parents who lost children, is the possibility that, they still survive. So we used to stand out in the middle of the winter in the parking lot, freezing our asses off, in the winter, and had our own meeting with all the parents, and we would talk about, all these things, which is, Phran and I looked at each other and said, well, there's got to be a place where people feel safe, to discuss their experiences. And we started these, we called them afterlife discussion groups, across the country, and they had a moderator and so forth. And we used to moderate a group that met in Long Island. And what I would notice is that sometimes a new person would come into the group, and for the whole 2 hours they wouldn't say one word. And I understand that, the grief is horrible. And then they come to the second meeting, and we only had them quarterly because we didn't want to make it like a support group. We wanted to have it like a discussion group. And then the second meeting, they'd show up, and they also would not say a word. And then they come to a third meeting, and all of a sudden they start telling stories, of these after-death communications, like amazing, and I was like, where were you? I mean, why are you holding this in? Because it took them that long to feel safe to finally talk about this stuff, and it's a shame. But people also feel good hearing about these experiences that others have, because they know if it happens to them, that means that their loved one, is still around as well.
Mm-hmm. Have you gotten messages from your daughter?
Well, since my wife was so intuitive, she would get messages like crazy, constantly. I don't have much intuitive ability, so I was just living vicariously through all of her contacts. But remember I talked about dream visitations? I had 74 dream visitations from her over a 3-year period. I know there's 74 because my wife made me write them all down in a journal, and I did. They were all, incredible, and I used to feel good, after each one, because as I mentioned, I could have a conversation. I remember the first one I ever got, I just looked at her, I said, do you know that you're dead? And then of course I know, it's like whatever, but I'm not, But, so I had that. And so, and I've had other experiences where some people I didn't even know, later found out, who they were, and they would come to me. So I came to the conclusion that I have some sort of ability for people to get through when I'm unconscious, but I'm useless when I'm conscious. So, yes. But yeah, there were eventually there were many incredible signs and communications. One of them, they showed in the documentary. We gave them Netflix the video clip. We were talking about Bailey, Phran, and I in the car. And we walked into our kitchen, and our kitchen had 9, I call them hi-hats, recessed, lighting. And I walked in, and then it was like the 4th of July, and it was like they were all going independently, going on and off and on and off, and I'm just standing there looking. And it lasted for about 10 full minutes, and then it stopped, and then I started to walk away, and Phran said, come back. I came back, and it was another 10-minute light show. And then I thought it was interesting because we were just talking about her like as we walked into the house, and then there was the thing. But to show you where my head was at, the next morning at 9 a.m. I had an electrician at the house, and I had him take down each one of the 9 lights to examine them to see if there was anything wrong, and he found nothing wrong. And then I had him take apart all the light switches to find out if there was any shorts or anything, and there wasn't. And it hadn't happened in the 10 years we had been living there, and it never happened in the 10 years after that we stayed. So that I would take, I ruled out, I think it's important to rule out the physical explanations, because some things are based upon physical phenomena, but in this case, since I ruled out the physical, I accepted that this was some sort of a communication. So it's stuff like that.
So, I mean, it's not, okay, so what I'm going to say is not applicable to that example, but sometimes I feel like it's the subconscious that is guiding you to the information you're seeking. And so I'll tell you an example of what I mean by it. There was a TikTok of a woman who was saying her brother had passed away. She asked him for a sign. She wanted to specifically see a purple elephant. Like, that's what she wanted to see. And she said, she was going about her day, and she ended up, like, there was a pile of, like, puzzles or something that was in her trunk for years, and she needed to get them out, and so she got them out, and one of the puzzles had a purple elephant on it, and so, like, she got her sign. And there's part of me that wonders whether or not her subconscious mind remembered that there was that puzzle there and led her there. And I don't, like, look, I don't want to yuck anybody's yum. Like, if someone believes they're getting directly communicated to by their deceased person, like, I want them to have that. But my logical brain is, I know how much we filter out because our brain can't take in all the stimulus that comes our way. And
Right.
so when you're saying, I want to hear from my loved one, and you're looking for something specific, it has a way of materializing because your subconscious brain is bringing it forward.
Well, that's certainly one explanation, and it's true. I mean, also, sometimes like a medium might say to you, oh, your loved one's going to send you a
Butterfly.
monarch
That's a common
butterfly,
one.
whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so now it's in your awareness, and
Yeah.
normally you might just dismiss it, but now when you see it, that's a sign. Yeah, that's certainly, a possibility. There are also, the theory that somebody in spirit, they didn't turn into the butterfly to appear to you, but they very well may be able to, through thought, to guide that butterfly to be by, your window. And they might also be able to guide you to look out that window at that specific time. So that's a possibility. The best way that I can, when people ask, how do I know whether it's a real sign? My experience is that the real after-death communications come attached to a knowing, where when it happens, instantly you say, I know, and that doesn't happen, all the time. But when it does, I take that as a true sign. And I'm really critical, at least, I was of signs, because not everything is a sign. I mean, people would say, my loved one always sends me pennies because I find pennies, in the ground. But, pennies are a worthless currency. If I drop a penny, I don't even bother to pick it up, So you're going to find pennies, But on the other hand, if you're really feeling bad and you're talking about you're talking to your loved one, you say, oh, could you leave me a penny today? And then just 5 minutes later, you see the penny and you pick it up and it has their date of birth on it. Maybe that's attached to a knowing, and you believe that whatever. So, yeah, I mean, it's always thing. What made me think when you mentioned before about whether it's a product of your imagination. And I once did a survey that is sent to about a couple of thousand people, and I said, would you rather get a communication from your deceased loved one directly or through a medium? And when I asked that question, I was convinced that the overwhelming majority was going to say directly, because that's what I would say. But it wasn't true. The majority said through a medium. So then I had to find out why. And there were two reasons. One, as we talked about before, some people are fearful of things that can't be explained in physical terms, so they're kind of afraid of it. But more often, people said that if I got it directly, I might think that it's a product of my own imagination.
Yeah.
Whereas if I got it through a professional, a third
Feels
party,
credible.
it feels credible.
Yeah.
And that made sense to me. So
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting.
So what I have said, we've been talking a lot about this in my family since my mom passed, and my sister one day brought up something and was like, I don't know if it's a sign or not. And what I kind of feel to help me is like, if it made you think of her, right? Like that can just be enough. Like that can be enough for right now, that it, but we've had a couple different things that have happened, and the night of my mother's wake, the light in front of our house had been out for about a year, and every time I'd be like, we have to get this fixed, it just didn't happen, right? We came home that night and that light was on. And it was on for that night and the next night, and then it went out. And then about a month later, I was in New York, and I had gone with my dad to Florida, and I flew back to New York, and I got back at like 2 a.m. and I came home and that light was on. Like it wasn't a question, that light was on. And I just walked in and I said, thanks, Mom. And the next night it was out again. Yeah. And so there's a part of that could be the coincidence of all coincidences, or it could be she was like, you know what, I can fix this light now. That's an easy fix.
Yeah, and the timing of it, it's not probable. And the theory is that once we transition to this next world. We don't have a body, but we're an entity of thought and energy. So you can affect other things that use energy, and that's why so many people have these light kind of phenomenon happen. But yeah, I mean that's an example, and most people would take that as a sign. And one of the things that you could do when you go to sleep at night is just set an intention. You could either say it out loud or just say it by thought, and Mom, come to me in a dream, but you can't make it happen. So like you take the thought and you just let it percolate out there. A lot of people it's like come to me, and you can't force psychic phenomena.
Because then you're thinking too much. You
Yeah,
have to turn everything off.
you just you just have to let it go.
Yeah. All right. Well, but before we let you go, tell for people who are curious about seeking a medium because they want that credible conduit to their loved one, what should they look for? And do you have any cautions that you would offer?
Yeah. Well, first, we were talking about the certification program. So all the mediums that we certified over the past 20 years are listed on our site. So they can go to foreverfamilyfoundation.org. Look under certified mediums, and there's links to each individual medium. Mediumship is it's not an exact science. So somebody you might get recommendation from a friend. A friend says I got a terrific reading, and you go to the same medium and you don't get a good reading. It's not but the good mediums are more consistent than others. So they rarely don't make a connection. Today you want to give the medium as little information as possible. I once, a friend of mine after my wife passed, asked if I wanted to get a reading from a medium. Bear in mind, I have never in the past 20 years got a reading from one of our certified mediums. Why? Because I can't trust the information because they know too much about me. So, so I won't. But then there's a medium that I didn't know that also appeared in the documentary, and my friend, who was a consultant for the film, asked if I wanted a reading, and I said, sure, on one condition. The only name that I'll provide is Bob, and we know there's a lot of Bobs out there. And I asked her to pay for the reading from her own PayPal account, and I would reimburse her so they couldn't, look it up. And I got an incredible reading, which really I was very, happy that I got. But today, you want to give them as little information as possible because, I've heard of cases where the medium's doing a reading on Zoom and they see the sitter in front of them, and on the other, they have a split screen. On the other side of the screen is the person's Facebook page. And how much information you could get from somebody's Facebook page, and they're just spitting back, totally fraudulent, reading, and the sitter is bewildered, thinking, "Wow, they're the greatest medium in the world." So you really have to be careful, and that's why you want to give them as little information as possible. Also, when a medium gives you a message, you can't really accept the message unless they first provide the evidence. So if they say, I have your mom, and your mom wants me to tell you that she loves you, how many moms don't love their kids, right? But if she's given you evidence after evidence after evidence, and then she has a message, you can take it. But a lot of mediums, they just think if they tell the sitter that, that so-and-so is proud of you, or that they love you, that their job is done and makes you feel better. Didn't make me feel better because, it was useless unless I believed that you were really talking to them. So, there are certain resources. The Windbridge Institute, which is a scientific organization, also, did mediumship research and with blinded protocol, and they have a list of mediums on their site. So there are many books that have been published that have recommendations. So, but if word of mouth is good, but sometimes you set up for disappointment because there has to be a resonance between the person in spirit and the sitter, and the medium. And if they're not resonating with each other, it's not going to happen.
Well, Bob, thank you so much for taking your time to talk with us and for the work that you're doing. It is very important, and I think that it is probably helping more people than you could even know. So thank you so much for being here.
Well, I enjoyed it, and thanks, Christy, and thanks, Danielle. Hope to see you both again soon.
If you want to have more of your own opposite of small talk conversations, we can help.
We've created a starter pack of big talk questions that you can download and use to ditch the boring small talk and create more meaningful conversations with the people around you. Get it in the link below. If you liked this episode, please subscribe and leave us a comment. Let us know what you think of this topic and what you'd like to hear about next. Thanks for watching.
Stay curious and talk big.